Alrighty. How's it going? Alright, so I'm doing my little presentation here, my narration on the FCC and ITU. What is the FCC? The FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, is an independent government agency directly overseen by Congress. It is largely concerned with the implementation and enforcement of communication laws in the United States and regulations. So what I found is that it's broken into many different bureaus and offices that collaborate with each other to achieve goals that the FCC sets out. At the head of all of this is 5 commissioners who are appointed by the President of the United States. And one interesting thing that I found is that they're supposed to be bipartisan. So only 3 can have the same party affiliation as the president that appointed them. And there's usually one rolling vacant seat, I believe, is what I found. I didn't find anything explicitly stating that, but right now there's only 4. There's the chairwoman and there's 3 other commissioners that sit at the head of this, and then there's a vacant seat, and there has been for quite some time. So just kind of a brief history of the FCC. Before the FCC, before we have this kind of centralized way of regulating communications within the United States, there were 2 completely unregulated industries, which was the content carriers and the common carriers. Content carriers took on the form of broadcast media, the news media, things such as, and then common carriers dealt with the transportation of individuals and information, so railroads, physical mail, things like that. But these 2 industries had maybe 2 or 3 companies that had monopolies on the entire thing. So it was all privately owned at one time, which created a few problems, some damaging issues that needed to be taken care of. And this is where the Communications Act of 1934 comes in, with the creation of the FCC formally, and initially the main goal was just to regulate these rampant monopolies. And after this, the prerogative kind of changed to deregulation, and in more recent years, splitting up huge companies like AT&T and things like that. So the roles of the FCC has a lot of specific roles, more than the ones listed on their site. But what I found is that largely they're responsible for ensuring equity of broadband internet access for various communities and low-income households. They expand infrastructure, especially in rural areas, places that might not have the same access to infrastructure as we do. And they also compile broadband data to figure out where the help is needed the most. Telehealth is kind of this new concept that they also work with. And it keeps people connected to healthcare providers, their doctors, hospitals, things like that. And they also kind of take on a role to defend against scam calls and spoof calls and things like that as well in the modern age where we require that. The rules of the FCC, so there are different types of rules. Legislative ones are rights and regulations that are legally binding, right? So they're broken, there's punishment, fine, jail time even. And then there's non-legislative rules that are broken down into 2 subsets. And interpretive rules allow for some wiggle room in interpretation of the FCC as they see fit. And then the other is the policy statements that attempt to explain the exact extent of their discretionary power. And, these 2 things are sort of fluid. They change internally. But they also have these procedural rules as well. And these explain the organization. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the policy statements. right, it dictates, these procedural rules dictate how they make the decisions. And the rulemaking process for the FCC consists mostly of identifying a problem by Congress or a petition, or maybe somebody in the public comes forward and they take it into advisement, and then they go through a series of trial and error, comments, communication, until the final rule is made. So depending on what route they need to specifically take. Moving on to the ITU. The ITU, or the International Telecommunications Union, is an agency controlled by the United Nations that seeks to establish a worldwide standard of communication. It's actually based in Geneva, Switzerland, which would make sense because, the Geneva Convention and so on and so forth. It is a huge conglomerate of 193 member states. Excuse me. The agency is divided into different sectors responsible for their own tasks, much as the same as the FCC's bureaus. And these sectors include radio communication, standardization, development, and ITU telecom. So, some pretty big stuff happening there. Lots of work to be done. The basic history of the ITU was first established in 1865 to manage the new international telegraph networks. It was kind of a budding technology at the time. And Switzerland kind of took the helm, so to speak, and gets that first step in creating some sort of way to facilitate that. Some major developments would include the Radio Telegraph Convention, held in 1906. It established SOS as the Universal Maritime Signal for an emergency, and call for help. So, famously used by the Titanic. I didn't know that, so it's kind of an interesting tidbit. And the culmination of international collaboration led to the creation of the ITU under the umbrella of the UN in 1947, shortly after World War II. And of course there were some difficulties that came with this, right? Like World War I, they didn't meet for the entirety of World War I, not until 1925. They didn't meet. And it was actually under a different name then. So, the culmination of that was the, Geneva Convention that created the UN. It's some rules. So, these sectors that the ITU is broken up into. I might have to cut this out. Yeah, so these sectors work much like the bureaus of the FCC, and they are further organized into study groups that identify and collect data on issues to identify and prove that there's a problem, and the identifications of these issues and problems is then turned into recommendations that help guide possible resolutions that are eventually ratified into law. They vote on this in the UN, and they help to push a lot of those issues through, especially for telecommunications and so forth. Their roles are a whole number of things. The agency seeks to do many things. They enable the growth of telecommunications globally. They facilitate universal access, and they create standards for the infrastructure globally. So a lot there. It's kind of loaded. Probably too much to... What they actually do is probably too much to explain within the confines of this assignment. But it boils down to basically that. And then here's why we're excited. So thanks so much.